Elias Thorne did not believe in the afterlife, but he was a devout worshipper of the viral algorithm. To him, the world was a series of locations waiting to be exploited for clicks, and the dead were the most reliable co-stars because they never demanded a cut of the revenue. For years, Elias had built a massive following as a cynical urban explorer, a man who treated haunted asylums and ancient burial grounds like personal playgrounds. His brand was built on disrespect, mocking anything sacred to spike his engagement metrics. However, the digital landscape was changing. His views were stagnating, and his audience was hungry for something more visceral. To reclaim his throne, he needed to go somewhere truly forbidden. He needed Shadow Vale Cemetery. Shadow Vale was a place of deep, local silence. Tucked away in a forgotten fold of the mountains, it served as the final resting place for the unclaimed, the drifters, the outcasts, and those whose names had been washed away by time. The locals spoke of the restless guardian, a primordial force that ensured the dignity of the forgotten remained unsoiled. They said the guardian didn't haunt the cemetery, it was the cemetery itself. People avoided the valley even in broad daylight, but Elias saw only an opportunity for a graveyard challenge that would shatter the internet. He arrived as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting skeletal shadows across the overgrown mounds of earth. He set up his expensive cameras with the practiced ease of a man who saw the world through a viewfinder. His target was the grave of the nameless woman, a healer from the 1800s who had supposedly been betrayed and buried alive. Her headstone was a jagged, mossy slab surrounded by small offerings, dried lavender, river stones, and a tarnished copper coin. Elias stared at the tokens with disgust. "Is this what passes for a curse these days?" he told his audience, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He pulled a flask from his jacket and poured whiskey over the grave, watching it darken the stone. Then, with a mocking grin, he swung his heavy boot, kicking the lavender and stones into the tall grass, erasing the evidence that anyone still cared for her soul. As he spoke, the air around him underwent a subtle, sickening change. His camera began to stutter. Jagged lines of digital static tore across the screen, and the live chat scrolled frantically. The viewers were hearing things, low, rhythmic whispers that sounded like heavy breathing coming from the ground itself. Elias dismissed it as interference, but even he couldn't ignore the sudden drop in temperature. His breath became a thick, white vapor that hung in the air like a shroud, and the ground beneath his feet began to feel soft and spongy, as if the soil were becoming liquid. A smell permeated the air, the heavy, cloying scent of wet, freshly turned earth. It was so thick he could almost taste the grit on his tongue. It wasn't the smell of decay, but the smell of the deep, dark soil where the sun never reached. His skin prickled with an instinctive warning, a primal urge to run that his ego fought to suppress. "Just some mountain fog, guys," he told the camera, though his bravado was starting to fray at the edges. He packed his equipment with uncharacteristic speed, feeling a weight in the air that seemed to press against his chest. As he retreated to his SUV and shifted into reverse, his dashboard display flickered to life, showing the rear-view camera's feed. There, standing exactly where he had stood moments ago, was a tall, dirt-encrusted figure. It was a silhouette of mud, its long arms hanging limp. Terrified, Elias spun his head around to look out the back window, but the road behind him was empty. There was only moonlight hitting the tombstones. When he looked back at the screen, the figure was gone. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias floored the accelerator, the tires spitting gravel as he sped away from the valley, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Elias Thorne didn't stop driving until the neon lights of the city drowned out the memory of the mountain's silence. His luxury penthouse usually felt like a sanctuary of his own making. Tonight, it felt like a cage. The silence of the penthouse was unnatural, a heavy, airless vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He slammed the door, the click of the smart lock providing a false sense of security. The high-tech security cameras showed nothing but static, yet the feeling of being watched was a physical weight. He immediately went to his workstation, driven by the desperate need to see the footage, to prove to himself that the figure in the rearview camera had been a trick of light. He slotted the memory card into his computer, but the high-performance machine groaned under the load. Only one file appeared on the desktop, titled, "The Debt is Owed." When he tried to open it, the screen bled into a deep, muddy brown, and the sound of his cooling fans rose to a frantic scream. The pixels seemed to crawl like insects across the glass, forming patterns that mimicked the jagged lines of the headstones. The monitor flickered with a rhythmic pulse. No matter how many times he tried to delete the drive, the words remained, burned into his monitor like a brand. A stinging sensation in his hands drew his attention away. Under the harsh LED lights of his desk, Elias saw his fingernails. They were rimmed with thick, black grime, heavy cemetery soil that refused to be dislodged. He rushed to the bathroom, scrubbing his skin raw with abrasive sponges, but the dirt seemed to be leaking from his very pores as if his body were turning to earth. When he stepped out of the shower, he saw the bruises. Encircling his ankles were dark, mottled impressions of fingers, as if he had been held down in the dark by hands that belonged to the grave. Sleep was an impossibility, yet exhaustion eventually claimed him. He was jolted awake at exactly 3:00 a.m. by his smart home system. The lights flickered to a low, funerary amber. From the speakers, a slow, mournful dirge began to play, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. A rhythmic thud cut through the music. Thwack, scrape, thwack. Each strike of the spectral blade against the earth vibrated through his bones. It was the unmistakable sound of a shovel, echoing from inside the very walls of his penthouse. Driven by a growing dread, Elias researched the nameless woman. He discovered she was a healer who was betrayed and buried alive by the town she helped. She had given everything to save her neighbors, yet they feared her power and condemned her to the dark. She spent her final moments suffocating under the weight of the dirt they threw upon her, clawing at her coffin. She valued the dignity of death because hers had been stolen with such calculated cruelty. Elias realized the Guardian wasn't just a ghost. It was a force of nature that punishes those who treat the transition of life to death as a joke. Panic set in. Elias grabbed his phone to call his manager, needing a human voice to tether him to reality. The call connected, but there was no greeting. Instead, he heard the wet, heavy slap of mud being thrown into a hollow box. He tried his friends, but every voice was replaced by that same rhythmic shoveling. He was being cut off, buried in a digital casket. The Guardian was systematically erasing his world, replacing it with the sensory horrors of the grave he had defiled for viral fame. He retreated to his bedroom, hoping for the morning sun, but as he pulled back the duvet, his heart stopped. The pristine white sheets were gone, buried under a massive mound of cold, damp cemetery soil that smelled of ancient rain and rot. A single, rotted lavender flower rested where his head should have been. The petals were black and slimy, weeping a dark fluid that stained the pillowcase, a silent testament to the life he had trampled. Elias staggered back, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. He could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on the building, as if the apartment were being swallowed by the valley. He realized there was nowhere left to hide, for the debt had followed him home. Elias scrambled for his car keys, his fingers shaking violently. The luxury apartment felt like a tomb, the walls closing in with the rhythmic thud of spectral shovels hitting the floorboards. He knew there was no escaping the debt in the city. The neon lights were a lie, a thin veil over the ancient, hungry darkness he had awakened. He ran to the parking garage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he ignited the engine of his SUV, the GPS screen didn't show the city map. It displayed a single pulsing coordinate in the heart of the valley. The drive back to Shadow Vale Cemetery was a descent into madness. Every road he took seemed to twist back on itself. The GPS voice was no longer a helpful guide. It was a raspy, collective whisper of 1,000 voices directing him toward the silence. Time became elastic, minutes stretching into hours. Just as the rusted iron gates of the cemetery loomed in his high beams, the engine gave a final wheezing gasp and died. The electronics went dark simultaneously, leaving Elias in a silence so profound it hurt his ears. He stepped out into the cold night air. The moon hung above the valley, bloated and stained a deep, bruised crimson. Elias found the grave of the nameless woman. It looked even more pathetic and lonely than before, still marred by the alcohol he had poured and the offerings he had kicked aside. Without a word, he dropped to his knees. He didn't use a cloth. He used his bare hands. He began to scrub the headstone, his skin tearing against the rough, cold stone. He wept, the tears mixing with the grime on his face as he tried to rearrange the scattered flowers. He was a man begging for his soul, realizing his life of vanity was nothing in the face of eternity. The air suddenly grew still. A shadow detached itself from the ancient oaks, the restless guardian. It didn't roar. It simply stood there, a towering presence of moving earth and ancient sorrow. As it approached, the weight of the void pressed down on Elias. He felt the crushing cold of the earth and the agonizing, slow passage of years in total darkness. The Guardian was forcing him to experience the very oblivion he had mocked. He understood now that the dead were not props or content. They were a legacy of silence that demanded reverence. "Take it," Elias choked out, pulling his expensive 8K camera from his bag. He laid it on the freshly cleaned grave. "Take the fame. I will never speak of this again." He was offering his identity, the digital ghost he had built to mask his emptiness. The suffocating pressure peaked, a ringing silence that felt like a mountain resting on his shoulders, and then, with a sharp, cold snap, it vanished. The first rays of dawn were grey and weak when the locals arrived. They found a man huddled against the nameless woman's headstone, shivering in the morning dew. When he looked up, they gasped. The man who had arrived as a vibrant youth now looked decades older, his hair bleached to a ghostly, stark white. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up and walked toward the gate, leaving behind the broken plastic that looked like trash against the sacred soil. Back in the world of the living, the digital empire of Elias Thorne vanished. His accounts were deleted by a persistent, untraceable glitch. However, a single unlisted link began to circulate. The footage was grainy, filmed from deep within the earth looking up at the headstone. In the video, Elias is seen kneeling in terror while a dirt-covered hand slowly reaches into the frame to stroke his hair. The caption was simple: "Silence is the only respect the dead require."